Hit us with it.
Well, it is. Look, there's been a cascade, hasn't there, Sheila, of bad polling news for the Labour government. But this is even worse. Labour falling to its lowest rating in a YouGov poll in history, showing that. I mean, it's not just for Labour. This just shows how far we've travelled politically since the general election. Extraordinary fragmentation, perhaps the like of which we haven't really seen in a Westminster context before. So Reform doing what Reform have been doing for well over 100 polls, which is coming, by some margin out on top, 27% of the vote. And then extraordinarily, you have Labour, the Conservatives, Greens and the Lib Dems all nip and tuck between 15 and 17 points. Labour on 17, Conservative on 17, Green on 16, which is a substantial improvement since Zack Polanski became leader of the Greens, and Lib Dems on 15. So more or less all within the margin for error. You know what that means, Sheila? In a first-past-the-post context, that means absolute chaos. People coming up, if we had a general election next week, right, people will be coming up to you and me and people like us going, what's going to happen? And the only legitimate, credible answer we could give is we haven't got a clue, because in a proportional system the like of which you get this wouldn't be an unusual looking poll in a many continental European countries, but it is a very historically unusual poll and set of polls. It's not alone in a British context where of course we have first past the post, and you put that set of data into the first past the post function machine, and what do you get? God knows.
But literally no thoughts on what you'd get.
No, and that's it. Time to go to the break, I suppose. Back to the calls.
I want some thoughts on what you'd get.
No, well, look, I mean, what you'd get. I mean, what is, I mean, obviously, and we should say, of course, not a general election for a long time, although, of course, we do have very important elections coming up next year, local council elections.
That'll come round soon enough.
Indeed, May 20, we've got the Senedd, Holyrood, and so on.
Yep.
We had a sort of glimmer of this in a way, of course, in Caerphilly last week in the Senedd by-election, where, of course, that's the thing. This is, in terms of polling, this would be the situation in England. But you throw into that confusion in Wales and Scotland, the SNP and Plaid, respectively, as well. So you're talking about basically six, ish party politics in different parts of the country. I think, look, what you would potentially see is, obviously massive turnover in particular seats, and you would see very particular contests in different places. So if you're looking for some glimmer of hope, if you're in number 10 from this right now, what you could say is two things. One, yes, Reform have been in front for a long time, but it is interesting that there does seem to be, from what we can see in the polls, a ceiling on their support. I remember talking to Reform people at the start of this year, and they would say this is a year of consolidation, and it's also a year where we start to reliably break through the 30% kind of mark. That hasn't happened. I think one of the reasons that hasn't happened is because they've actually had a couple of quite serious self-inflicted wounds. We saw what happened in this very studio, indeed, about paracetamol and all of that sort of nonsense. We've seen some of the people that they had at their party conference getting behind quite sort of obscure recherche kind of like online right stuff around Lucy Conley or whoever it happens to be, which, if you're sort of sat there thinking, I quite like some of the things Reform are saying, I don't like Keir Starmer, I don't like Kemi Badenoch, but you're a bit worried about some of their perhaps connotations they've had in the past, or perhaps that they might have extreme views. What we saw with Sarah Poachin this weekend, for some reason being obsessed by the colour of people's skin on the television. That sort of thing, I think, is potentially putting a bit of a ceiling on their support. And that might give you some hope if you're in number 10. The other thing that might give you some hope if you're in number 10 is that Caerphilly result, in a weird way, even though it was terrible for Labour.
11%?
Appalling,
11%.
Yeah, in this sort of Labour heartland. What you did clearly see is a lot of tactical voting to keep Reform, and by extension, Farage out. And if you're Labour, Keir Starmer made a sort of decision.
And just to be clear, that sent people to Plaid. It got more Plaid voters out than it would typically
Unfortunately for Labour, it was tactical voting away from them. So that's unfortunate. But I suppose what you could argue, is that certainly outside of Wales and outside of Scotland, although Welsh and Conservative and Labour MPs wouldn't be happy about that, but outside of a by-election situation, you might say that could vindicate Labour's strategy for the last 6 months, which has been slightly unusual, which was they have made politics about Farage. About 6 months ago, maybe a bit less, Starmer on number 10 said, we basically think the Tory party is dead. We think our competition now is between us and Farage. That is what his whole conference speech was about. So you might say that if you can basically make the next election about a Farage bloc and an anti-Farage bloc, that Labour is the natural leader of that anti-Farage bloc, and therefore try and configure politics in that way. But it's high stakes and it's high risk.
Let's talk about the Green Party briefly here. Since Zack Polanski took over, it has seen a leap, as you said here in this poll. What's his appeal, do you think?
Well, I think his appeal, Sheila, for a certain type of voter, particularly younger voters, is that Look, there's an old saying in politics, which is the medium is the message. And what that basically means is that the way the mediums that you have, whether that was initially print in newspapers and then television and now social media, that is the thing that crafts politics. It crafts not only how politics...
And we saw that for years in the papers here, didn't we?
Completely.
Yeah.
And so, you had politicians who were brilliant on television, like Ronald Reagan. In a sense, you wouldn't probably have had a Ronald Reagan without television.
Without telly. Yeah.
In the same way, you wouldn't have had Donald Trump without Twitter. The mediums of communication that we have shape the sort of politicians that we get. And Farage and Polanski are both made for the content era that we're living in. You know who isn't? Keir Starmer. Now, that might not be good. I'm not saying that's a great thing. That doesn't necessarily make for better...
really interesting
It doesn't make for better politics.
Yeah.
But it is the politics that we're living in. If we look at, we talk about
It's
reform,
where people are.
It's where people are, and it's how politics is being manufactured, if you like, in people's heads. Yeah. So if you look at this poll is quite interesting in terms of where those Labour voters have gone, because you had 34% of the electorate itself. Not a great number, it had to be said, who voted Labour at the last election. It was the lowest percentage for any incoming government in a century. So 50% of those Labour voters, according to this poll, are still going to vote Labour. Only 50%. Then 18% are going to vote Green. 13% are going to vote Lib Dem. 11% are going to vote Reform, and 5% are going to vote Conservative. I think they're a bit confused. But, you always get that in any particular poll. So, that's the sort of challenge as well for Labour. Where do you put your cards away? Where do you put your chips? Do you try and kind of get all of those back in one way, or do you focus on, clearly, the left of centre voters who have deserted you for the Greens and the Lib Dems? Because right now, again, we talk about reform all the time, but according to this poll, the biggest cohort of voters who have left the Labour Party since the election have gone to the Greens by quite some substantial margin by comparison to reform.
Just a final thought. If that poll today, YouGov poll, was the results of the general election, could it, by its very nature, force our hand on the type of electoral system we have?
It's possible. I suppose it would just entirely depend on the outcome. You could imagine a world where suddenly it has been in the... Why have we had first past the post for basically since we've been a democracy? There have been various points, including about a century ago, where we almost lost it. We almost didn't... we almost decided to move to either a V or a more proportional system. We haven't, largely because, for Labour and the Labour and Conservative duopoly...
It served them.
It has served them. It guarantees them first and second place. Usually Labour second place, usually Conservative first place, but it keeps everybody else out. Obviously, if we really were to move to a system where basically we had a multi-party democracy funneled through the vice, the straitjacket of first past the post, with all of the uncertainties that could create, if it no longer serves the duopoly...
If the reality of the electorate speaks...
Just basically says, this doesn't work for us anymore, then it is possible that Labour and the Conservative out of self-interest more than anything else. Because at the moment, for example, who would most benefit from first past the post right now? Probably the Conservatives, ironically, from proportional representation, sorry. It would ironically be the Conservatives, because if they only got 17% of the votes, they would get at least about 70% of the seats, give or take. Whereas right now on the first past the post, you wouldn't guarantee them getting that.